The salină salt pans and salt harbors in the Maltese Islands. In the Maltese Islands we find three types of salt pans: those that formed naturally, those that were carved from the rocks, and those that were built. Salt harvesting is one of the oldest jobs in Malta, where the need to preserve food and fish forced farmers to gather and produce salt for their everyday needs. Salt naturally forms in rock depressions that formed due to erosion. Through this process, rain, wind, and waves erode softer rock, leaving behind a network of irregularly shaped pools. These are filled with seawater through wave action. This then evaporates, leaving behind salt. Salt also forms in coastal pools, especially in low-lying areas like Adira and Melha Bay. With the passage of time, some of these holes were dug out further, enlarged and improved. Thus, the productive area was expanded to take up all the areas available, and production increased and the labor made more manageable, especially the irrigation of the salt pans and large reservoirs. Here, seawater is stored, and from where the salt pans are irrigated and filled to the optimal depth. With the arrival of the Knights of St. John in Malta, the salt pans began to be dug in a more sophisticated manner, where advanced planning was undertaken by engineers of the order. Thereon, salt pans were developed in very precise designs: deep wells to haul up water from depth, water channels that transported water by gravity, cold and warm water reservoirs, drying areas where water seeps out of salt piles, stones, wooden and clay, water gates, stairways and overflow passages to remove excess water. In short, the salt pans became a masterpiece of architecture and operated in astonishing efficiency. The Knights invested heavily in salt production in Malta. This is because in those times in Europe, salt was very precious and was worth gold. In fact, in Europe, as well as in Africa, salt was known as white gold. During the navigation, merchant ships and warships, which didn't have enough salt, risked running out of food. This was also true for countries during the winter months. In Malta, the Knights found favorable environmental conditions for the production of salt, and they made good use of this. As salt production requires huge volumes of seawater, they decided to invest in a new structure in the sea, in Salină Bay. The first step required the construction of an island made up entirely of clay, with exits level on which the salt pans could be constructed, thus introducing the third type of salt pans in Malta, those constructed and intended to operate on an industrial scale. In fact, the production was high enough to suffice for local needs and a surplus for export. These salt pans, like many others, were designed as a network of salt pans, but operated very differently, as the pans were all below sea level. By opening a sluice gate, fresh seawater is introduced in the outer large reservoir, where silt and seaweed sink to the bottom and the water starts to warm slightly. After a number of days, water passes through a second sluice and into the second large reservoir, which is called semi-warm. Subsequently, water enters the warm water pans. Here the water is kept for several months, slowly turning into brine with a high percentage of salt content. At this stage, the brine flows into the crystallizing salt pans, where salt crystals start to form. With the onslaught of industrialization, particularly with frozen foods, the demand for salt fell drastically, leading to the deterioration of the salt pans until, during a heavy storm, the weakened walls protecting the salt pans collapsed and the salt pans was flooded by mud and seawater and was inoperable.